Good morning and welcome to the London meeting of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Today we'll take evidence on the impact of COVID-19 on the public finances and the fiscal framework in advance of consideration of the summer budget revision next week. This morning we are joined for our first agenda item by John Cullinan, who's a Tax Policy Director of the Chartered Institute of Taxation, and Professor Jim Gallagher. I welcome you warmly both to the meeting and thank you very much for your written submissions. Can I start with a very general question? What, in your view, are the main risks for the Scottish budget arising from the impact of COVID-19, including the operation of the fiscal framework? Given the extent of those risks, is there a need to make any temporary adjustments to the framework? And if so, what should these priorities be? And can I ask John Cullinan to address this first, please?
Thank you. I suppose, first of all, it's fair to say that, that's a very broad question, and we base our comments very much on the practical expertise of our members in operating the tax system. So I'm not sure how well placed we are to give a good, honest overview. But in terms of, I guess, in terms of what's evident to our members, clearly there will be an effect on the income tax base, and clearly there is a risk that could be disproportionate to the UK as a whole. So something like that would really reflect on the kind of very nature of the fiscal framework. So we're kind of getting, into very political territory there, clearly, but that does stand out. In not a kind of immediate priority, but in terms of things that we could look to improve on in the fiscal framework within the same broad political settlement, would be it has shown up that the need for sometimes quick responses. It's a relatively modest point in the scale of things, but a kind of example of that would be the additional dwelling supplement for LBTT, where if people are selling a house and maybe they buy their new house before they sell their old one, they're given a time period to buy the new one, and they can claim the additional supplement back. And obviously, the housing market pretty well seized up during the lockdown. So they're going to take more time, and an adjustment was made for that. So it kind of does highlight the need sometimes for tax changes to be made quickly, and sometimes that can be done by secondary legislation. But maybe a kind of annual finance bill, or a kind of regular annual opportunity for primary legislation might be helpful there, both in dealing with those changes and dealing with it in a way that gives full democratic scrutiny.
Thanks, John. Jim, do you want to pick up on that? And have you got any comments you'd like to make?
I think to start, convener, I think I start with distinguishing between the long and the short term here, or the medium and the short term. In the medium term, the effect of COVID on the public finances will be very substantial indeed, and that will, as I said in my note of evidence, I think we're looking in the medium term at an economy in which is overall smaller, and in which the public sector plays a larger part for a variety of reasons. And that will be the context in which Holyrood finds itself making tax and spending choices over the next few years. In the shorter term, and referring particularly to the fiscal framework, it seems to me that, to a first approximation, actually, the fiscal framework is doing what it said in the tin. It's behaving more or less as it ought to have done. And in particular, it has substantially, in the current year, insulated the Scottish budget from the immediate fiscal effects of COVID. So, for example, it was designed to produce spending certainty, and again, to a first approximation, it has. because any immediate drops in tax revenue or income tax revenue are not reflected, don't impact on this year's budget. There are, however, longer-term questions about the extent to which, as John says, the Scottish economy will be affected differently, or may be affected differently, and that may invoke the provisions in the fiscal framework, but I rather doubt myself if it would. In the very short term, however, in the current year, I think it's appropriate indeed to focus on land and buildings transaction tax, because that's one which, under the fiscal framework, the Scottish budget bears the whole risk of, the absolute risk of, and it's fallen off a cliff. We don't know exactly by how much it's fallen off, but transactions have stopped, and it's also possible that house prices will have gone down. So that's a hit of revenue, numbering perhaps a couple of £100 million to the Scottish budget. And I wonder if it wouldn't be appropriate for the Scottish Government and the Treasury to agree an adjustment to the framework, perhaps to allow additional borrowing in the current year so that unplanned reductions in expenditure are not made.
That's very helpful. That's a helpful signal to a priority for us as a committee, Jim. I'm grateful for that. But my next question is for John. I note from your paper, John, that the situation created by COVID-19 highlights the importance of being able to make necessary tax changes quickly without sacrificing scrutiny. And you made some comment about that in your first answer. But that's a pretty difficult square to circle. And I don't want to preempt the important work that the Devolved Taxes Working Group is undertaking, but perhaps you could give us the CIT's view on how best to solve that particular puzzle about making tax changes quickly without sacrificing scrutiny. It seems to be a bit of a difficult square to circle, as I said. John?
Well, I mean, there's a range of devices, I suppose, that could be looked at. I mean, obviously, the kind of tradition in Westminster is brought about by hundreds of years of history, but they have budget resolutions whereby they can bring into effect budget proposals immediately, but that has a limited time span and has to be kind of endorsed by a full primary legislative change later in the year. So I mean, there are a number of approaches like that that could be looked at. I mean, I think I don't disguise it's a kind of difficult problem, and time is always short for primary legislation. But that there are surveys of public public views and opinions on this, which suggest that people have a very low awareness, and this is true throughout the UK, I'd have to say, but also low awareness in Scotland of the specifics of the devolution arrangement. So if one of the benefits of devolved power is greater relevance and accountability to the people in whose name it's exercised, that is threatened a little bit if people just simply don't understand underneath all this complexity about the framework and what's decided in Westminster and what's decided in Scotland and so on. That can be a little bit undermined. So trying to find some way of bringing the maintenance of the tax system into the ambit of regular review by the primary legislators, would be desirable, we think.
Hey, John. Finally, I'd like to ask Jim a question before I go to Jackie Bailey. Jim, can I ask, in your paper you state that there's persistent overestimation of income tax revenues wholly unrelated to COVID has left a bit of a gap in the budget. Can you clarify what you mean by that, whether that refers to the Scottish Fiscal Commission's forecasts or Scottish income tax?
Yes, it primarily does refer to the Scottish Fiscal Commission's forecasts, which have proved over-optimistic. The background, convener, as you'll remember, is that we had to start somewhere, when we made an assumption about income tax revenue, and we started with the GERS numbers, which turned out to be too high, and that's maybe not surprising in that they were based on survey data rather than actuals. But what we've had to do is make a transition to actual Scottish income tax revenue, and in the Scottish Fiscal Commission's job has been to forecast what the actuals will be. And I'm not necessarily saying that this in a critical sense, but the Commission's estimates have always proved to be too high. And it seems that the underlying, the presenting issue is that the forecast number of people paying the higher rates of tax hasn't been as high as they predicted. And in my own view is that this reflects both the structure and the relative performance of the Scottish economy over the period. The result, the idea is that, as you will well understand, I'm sure, that we reconcile to actuals over a period of 3 years as the income tax revenue trickles in. The aim of that is to give the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, spending certainty in each year. But the result is that the adjustments are carried forward to future years. It turns out on this occasion, in recent years, that all the adjustments have been negative, and all of them have been pushed forward. None of the Scottish Government has not taken the opportunity, if you want to call it an opportunity, to adjust spending downwards because it is short of revenue, and it's postponed all those adjustments until after 2021, which may be a magic date for political reasons, of course. The result is a big gap in the Scottish Parliament's budget at that point, and that's not a great time to have a gap.
Okay. Right. Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Convener. I want to pursue a bit further the question of the risk of differential impacts on the economy, because we know some of the consequences that would have in terms of the fiscal framework. But it's difficult to judge because we don't know with any degree of certainty. But commentators have suggested that because we've been in lockdown longer, because more businesses have closed north of the border than south, and indeed our reliance on the oil and gas industry and tourism and hospitality suggests that there may be a greater risk. And I wonder whether, we start with Jim Gallagher, if he believes that we will suffer a reduction in budget as a consequence of that greater risk.
You're asking me to forecast the future, which is the one thing I don't know very much about, but there is certainly a risk that this could happen. The risk could come from the causes you suggest. However, it could also reflect the different structure of the Scottish economy compared to the UK economy as a whole. Two things might be relevant there. One is a greater dependence on sectors which are badly affected. You've mentioned oil and gas, which is, of course, not so much badly affected by COVID, but is having its own issues at the moment. And then there are leisure and tourism sectors where we don't know what the relative effect will be. Obviously, leisure is going to be hit across the whole country. It's possible that in the medium term, Scottish tourism may actually do rather better if people holiday in the UK rather than holidaying abroad. The other countervailing factor is, of course, we have a higher public sector in our economy, a higher proportion of the public sector, and that will not be affected. So it's what the balance of these things will be. Remembering all the time that we're talking about relative decline. We're not going to be on the up. The question is how far down we go.
Okay. I wonder whether I could ask another question of Professor Gallagher. In your submission to the committee, you talked about cooperation and collaboration between the Scottish and UK governments, and we've witnessed that during their response to the COVID-19 crisis. How important is that going forward? And should we trust to these relationships just occurring informally, or do we need a formal mechanism to make sure that it happens effectively?
I think that the cooperation issue will be even more important in the reconstruction phase than it has been in the immediate dealing with the epidemic. And the reason I say that is that governments have tried pretty hard to work together during the initial phases of this epidemic. They have to some degree laid aside their pre-existing differences or mistrusts. That's begun to unravel a little, and it's not appropriate to go into that here, but both levels of government will have to coordinate in finding the right way to reconstruct the economy after this event. One of the striking things about the old devolution settlements, I think of it, the 1999 settlement, is the extent to which the functions of the different levels of government are well separated. There's not a lot of overlap. However, the one explicit bit of overlap in the 1999 settlement was indeed economic development, which is a function of both levels of government. And when we look at the circumstance we're about to enter, the tools which each level of government have to influence the economy, and one might think of, for example, the UK's furlough scheme, UK government's furlough scheme, and how it's going to be phased out, the UK government's business loans and how they're going to be phased out or guaranteed or repaid, the corporate taxation system, corporation tax, and some other aspects of it. For example, do we allow provisions in corporation tax against investment in the way that we once did and don't know at the moment? And the Scottish government's what you might call microeconomic interventions on grants to businesses, its approach on in infrastructure, its approach on education and retraining, for which we're going to have a substantial demand. Those things need to be coordinated. But our governments are going to find that very challenging, and we need to hold their feet to the fire on that.
Finally, if I may, Convener, can I just pursue the point about whether you think, Professor Gallagher, there needs to be a formal mechanism? Does one exist to enable that kind of collaboration between governments?
The mechanisms which exist are as you remember, the joint ministerial committees, which have had a checkered history over the last decade or so, indeed over longer than that. We have collectively failed, I think, to find really good mechanisms for the governments to work together. At a constitutional level, I've come round to the view that they should have a statutory underpinning in general, irrespective of the present crisis, and maybe that would help. But in the end, there is no substitute for our political leaders who may have their big differences, nevertheless getting together and cooperating as best they can and resisting the temptation to fall back on the tropes of normal politics, which they're good at and they know how to do, but we're asking them now to manage a crisis and to manage a huge programme of economic restructuring, and it's a very big ask, but people have got the right to ask it.
Thank you very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. We now go to Angela Constance, but I'm not sure Angela's going to have a camera. It may be sound only. Let's wait and see. Angela?
Good morning, Convener. Good morning to the panel. It is indeed sound only. Not quite sure what happened from our preparations earlier. I would like to ask Professor Gallagher, following on from Jackie Bailey's questioning about, that what the Professor describes as the immediate challenge for constructive engagement with UK ministers as they forum policy. Now, obviously, it takes two to tango, and there needs to be a willingness and an openness to early engagement. And I wondered if Mr. Gallagher could say a bit more about some of the other challenges over and above the mechanisms which we've debated a lot about in this committee. So, for example, we've heard from David Heald that the UK is one of the most fiscally centralised countries. The UK government have borrowing powers that the Scottish government doesn't have. And without being partisan, I think it's accurate to say that there's a power imbalance, as well as some of those more long-standing, cultural differences that are rooted in different organisations and different institutions. I just wonder, how can we, take things forward?
Jim, you can start with that. Maybe John will want to also come in after you, though.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener. Big questions, those. First, the level of centralisation and decentralisation. The UK as a whole has traditionally been a fiscally very centralised country, and England is still very fiscally centralised. And something needs to be done about that, but that's a different question from the one you wanted us to address. In terms of fiscal devolution in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, actually, the UK is, by international standards, really very decentralised. If you look at the proportion of expenditure and the proportion of taxation, which is decentralised in the UK, it's comparable broadly to that in Canada or in Switzerland, which are two of the most fiscally decentralised systems in the world. So the degree of fiscal centralisation is maybe a bit of a red herring here for the present circumstance. There is a power imbalance between governments. Central governments, federal governments in federal systems and the UK government in the UK system tend to hold more of the cards. And that's why when you're in a crisis, there's often a default to saying, well, the central government must do more about this. But they do need to work with the devolved government for the reasons I gave in answer to Jackie Baillie. I think you are absolutely right to say that it does take two to tango. And I can't dance for the life of me, but I do know that in dancing, sometimes it's necessary for one partner to take a steering role and one partner to understeer a bit. And it may be a very difficult relationship because of the politics here. But I'm slightly going to repeat what I said to Jackie Baillie, that the expectation that we have to put on government ministers on both sides is that they have to lay aside their preconceptions and their capacity to default to normal politics, which in Westminster is often an assumption that they are a central government and can behave like that, and in Holyrood may default to, well, we should have more power. We need to put both of those aside now and find constructive ways of rebuilding the economy after this crisis.
Jim, do you want to pick up some of that before we go back to Angela? John, I mean, sorry.
Yeah, sure. Well, just firstly, I totally agree with what Professor Gallagher said on the need for cooperation, and it's kind of almost impossible to imagine a system that is so technically perfect that you could dispense with the desirability of cooperation and the fact that there would be big costs potentially if that cooperation isn't forthcoming. One thing I would suggest though is it's kind of worth focusing not just on the sort of absolute level of devolved power, but also on the kind of coherence of the borderlines, because the more the borderlines are frayed and don't make a lot of sense, the more stress that you place on that need for cooperation. So, I mean, just one example, if you're an unincorporated business person in Scotland, your income tax level will be fixed at Holyrood, whereas if you incorporate your business, your corporation tax and the tax on the dividends, which is your own personal income that you take out of the company, will be fixed by Westminster. And we already have a kind of imbalance in the levels of those tax levels, even at the Westminster level, even for the equivalents of those people in England. So the more kind of rates diverge in Scotland, the more stress that is placed on that, and that's quite independent of the stresses and strains that would always come about on any country or jurisdiction when it varied income tax rates. That just reflects sort of oddities in the particular settlement. So, there are sort of features like that where you could look at the borderline. Again, it would have to be done by agreement with Westminster, obviously, and would probably require Westminster legislation. But there are things around the borders of the system that, without changing the world in terms of levels of devolved power, might just make more sense and might kind of leave the need for cooperation to focus on the really important things.
Angela, back to you.
Thanks, Convener. I want to pick up on a point about borrowing powers and economic development. As Professor Gallagher said, economic development is a shared competence, and he's already reflected that there's a different impact from the COVID crisis across both nations, just reflective of our different economies. And committees also received other evidence that reflects upon things like the Scottish Government can't borrow to fund additional COVID-19 related spend, and that the borrowing limits are really not designed for a crisis or indeed to be fleet of foot. So I wondered if the panel thinks that the lack of borrowing powers limit the Scottish Government's ability to respond effectively to a crisis like COVID, and whether or not more borrowing powers would allow a greater response to support economic recovery.
John, you want to pick up that first?
Surely. I think that's a wee bit of a red herring. The extraordinary response to the crisis at a UK level has involved a colossal additional amount of borrowing by the UK government. And of course, it could always have been more, but nevertheless, it is pretty substantial. And that has fed into the Scottish economy directly, mostly through the furlough scheme, very directly maintaining aggregate demand in the economy in a way which we have never seen before, ever. And it's fed through, secondarily, but very substantially, through the Barnett formula. And the committee will be probably more up to date than I am on the flow of Barnett consequentials, but as I recollect, it is somewhere between £3 and £4 billion at the moment. So I think that leaping to the idea of additional borrowing powers as the answer is premature. As I said in my written evidence, the most important thing to do is to find an integrated approach with the UK government so that devolved and reserved powers work together on this. And in particular, I have heard it suggested that the immediate response should be for the Scottish Government to borrow on its own account and not from the Treasury by issuing bonds. I think that would be a very silly thing to do at this time, not least because, astonishingly, during this crisis, for the first time ever, the UK Treasury was able to borrow at negative interest rates. And that's a facility, capacity to borrow at low or even negative interest rates, which Scotland should take advantage of via the UK's borrowing in that way.
John?
I don't think I've got anything about borrowing, to be honest.
Okay. Angela, back to you.
Convener, I suppose the point that I was hoping to get a more reflective response was the bit about government at all levels needing to be fleet of foot, and committees received evidence that has spoken about greater access to the National Loans Board, and instead of looking at other powers to enable quicker responses to, if I quote David Phillips, to develop and cost and announce, as opposed to having to wait, and sometimes given local circumstance people want to lead as opposed to being led. But that's my final point, Convener.
Was that a question or just a comment?
Oh well, I suppose it was more of a comment.
Just so I'm absolutely clear. In which case, can I go to Murdo Fraser?
Thank you, Convener. I've got two questions. Maybe I could put them initially to Jim Gallagher, if I can, please. And the first question is around the Barnett formula that you mentioned in passing just a moment ago. In the paper we've had submitted to us from David Phillips from the IFS, who we're hearing from shortly, he makes a point about the Barnett formula, that there might be a case for bypassing the Barnett formula to allocate funding on a needs-based approach if there are different impacts from COVID-19 in different parts of the UK. And I'd be interested to get your take on that, specifically in the context of the wider debate around Barnett, because we know that there are politicians in Wales and the north of England who for years have argued that Barnett is far too generous to Scotland, who would grasp at the opportunity to see Barnett reviewed. And I just wonder whether you think an approach like the one being proposed by David Phillips might have a short-term attraction, but in the longer term prove very dangerous in terms of the funding support that we in Scotland currently get through Barnett.
I, many years ago, Convener, proposed the foundation of a small society called the Friends of the Barnett Formula, of which I offered to be the honorary secretary and had the other member be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, whoever he or she was. And I proposed that largely for domestic Scottish reasons. The Barnett Formula produces a devolved budget in Holyrood, which is 25% or more per head higher than the equivalent spending in England. And as a former public official, like yourself, Convener, I spent a long time trying to find arguments to say to the Treasury that our level of expenditure was justified by our need. It is difficult to sustain these arguments when we're spending 25% per head more. And so at a purely tactical level, for Scotland's interest, I think that retaining the benefits of the Barnett Formula is something which we should give a high priority to. And substituting a needs assessment for Barnett would not be to Scotland's advantage. It might be fairer across the UK. It might be more intellectually coherent. It might be justifiable in that sense, but it would not be a good thing for the budget which your committee considers. So, and when I read my colleague David Phillips, whom I respect greatly, I must say, I can see that if I was sitting where he was sitting, I might say what he is saying, but I'm not, and I don't.
Murdo?
Thank you. That's a very, very clear response. I'd like to ask you a quite separate question about the fiscal framework. In your paper to us, you make an interesting comment around the fact that the mechanism for transferring income tax risk is per capita indexation, which was built into the original fiscal framework at the request of the Scottish Government to protect the Scottish budget from lower population growth in Scotland compared to the UK average. And you make the point, that this is hard to justify in principle, but you go on to make an interesting comment that as expectations of relative population growth may be changing, so might the views of the Scottish Government. And I wonder if you could just expand on what you mean by that.
I was hoping somebody would take that bait. The argument for per capita indexation of the block grant adjustment in the fiscal framework it is the Schleswig-Holstein question of Scottish politics, and of the three people who understand it, I may be the one who's gone mad. But the critical thing about it was that it means that if the Scottish the risk of relative population growth is not transferred to the Scottish bloc. I don't think that's fair, actually, because relative population growth is what determines the need for expenditure. I don't think it's fair. I can see why the Scottish Government argued for it, and I know the Treasury weren't very happy at the time because they didn't think it was right. However, two things have changed. One is that the Scottish population has perked up, rather. The Scottish population growth has gone up a bit, and I rather suspect that post-COVID and perhaps post-Brexit, which something we haven't yet discussed, UK population growth might not be quite so lively in future. This might not be quite such a big issue. And the fiscal framework is due for review at the instance of the Treasury 5 years after it was agreed. And there are things which the Scottish Government, as a result of COVID, might want from that review. They might want, as I said at the beginning, some kind of short-term easement of the unexpectedly large drop in stamp duty land tax. They might even want to argue for some postponement or easement of the big overhang of income tax overestimation, which will face us in 2021, and that might not be a good time to have a counter-cyclical cut in public expenditure. So the Scottish Government will be going to the Treasury and asking for things. My experience in negotiations with anybody, but especially with the Treasury, is that if you ask for things, you may have to offer some things back. And it might be that the per capita indexation issue turns out not to be as big a problem as the Scottish Government foresaw it 5 years back. So it may be scope for some negotiation there.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, Murdo, thank you. George Adam, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. As we come out of this crisis, we're also going to be looking at economic recovery and how that pans out. And I agree with Professor Gallagher that the devolved nations and the UK government need to keep the heat when we're having discussions on this. But as most of the economic levers for recovery rest with the UK government, this is obviously going to be a challenge for everyone because there's going to be a contrast between the challenges and priorities of the Scottish economy and that of the UK economy and other parts of the UK as well. So I would like to ask Professor Gallagher first and then John, what challenges and threats do you see for future funding for Scotland, and how do we go around that to make sure that we can actually work towards some form of economic recovery?
If I can go first, I think that you're putting together two connected but slightly separate issues there. One is the best approach to economic recovery, and the second connected and important issue is what this means for public service funding in Scotland. As for the former, you are right to say that the macroeconomic levers are largely in the hands of the UK government. And given the integration of the UK economy and the fact that on the whole, Scotland's, broadly speaking, in macroeconomic terms, around the UK average, I don't think it's likely that the right set of macroeconomic responses at a UK level will be the wrong set of macroeconomic responses for Scotland. To a first approximation, I think that's probably right. However, the microeconomic levers which we have and which are mostly devolved, for example, grants to businesses, training, physical infrastructure, and so on, may well require different responses in Scotland. The makeup of the economy, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the likely larger dependence on leisure and recreation and tourism in the Scottish economy will require a different balance of responses to support different sectors differently. Oil would be another example. So the coordination required will be quite detailed and quite substantial, which takes us back to the questions which colleagues were asking earlier about the intergovernmental mechanisms and the need to make them work better. As for the public spending, I think the answer that I would give is, in a sense, the answer I gave to the last question. Please keep hold of Barnett for fear of finding something worse. It produces, for the Scottish budget, 25% per head more expenditure in Holyrood than on the comparable services in England. And that's a huge advantage that we really must try our very best not to lose. I think there are some difficult questions coming because all borrowing is simply taxation transferred to the future. So in the medium term, the tax burden, if you think of it as a burden, in the UK and the Scottish economies will be higher because we will have to pay back at least some of the money that we have borrowed. And UK taxes will be higher, and it may well have to be that Scottish taxes will be higher as well, whether that's local taxes, Scottish income tax, or the other minor devolved taxes, because the public sector is going to be a larger part of a slightly smaller economy over the next 5 years or so. Does that answer your question, Mr. Adam?
Helpful, yeah.
Was a question to John as well, wasn't it, George?
Yes, I will.
John?
Okay, thank you. I think in terms of tax, the position with the devolved tax regime is that there are still substantial amounts of Westminster tax applying in Scotland, very substantial amounts, and the extent of devolution has brought about Scottish powers and scope for exercise of those. So I think the stresses and strains many of the stresses and strains that apply to the UK system are still with you, and I pointed to the stress and strain around the very different treatment of incorporated from unincorporated businesses before, and there's a similar and quite related fault line between the treatment of employed and self-employed people. And we can already see how they've come to the fore in the crisis, because when the Chancellor introduced the job retention scheme, the furlough scheme for employees, there was immediate pressure to do something similar for the self-employed, which was done quite soon, or announced quite soon after that. But that posed a much bigger challenge to the government. And indeed, one of the categories of people who are left out of both schemes is precisely those businesses who are suffering from the effects of the virus, but where they are chosen to incorporate, where the amount of support they can get is very, very limited. And that, I think, simply reflects the speed with which the things had to be put together and the difficulty of acting with the same speed on that part of the population. So I think you've got all those fault lines there, and they are UK wide, and they do impede on economic recovery and indeed on the resources of both governments to deal with it. But then I think you've also got a Scottish dimension through what you try to do with your tax system. So, for example, adopting the Adam Smith principles, including ability to pay. And, one of the kind of examples of that is the very progressive rates of LBTT, which have been alluded to before. There is a question mark really as to when you're applying these principles like ability to pay, you should try and do that in each particular chunk of tax or chunk of tax rules that you have power over, or whether you should step back and say what's the best way of reflecting that in the system as a whole, without necessarily pushing each principle as far as it will go in the context of each tax, because it's turned out there's at least an issue there as to whether that doesn't have something to do with the shortfall in revenues, because ultimately if you push up tax rates, there's always an issue you have to look at in terms of what will the reaction of taxpayers be. But at the end of the day, it's much easier for people to forego transactions in the housing market than it is for them to forego earning an income, for example. So the trade-off between how far you can push the principles and what's practical, and whether there's a behavioural pushback, is possibly different in different parts of the tax system. And I think one of the lessons that does apply locally is whether it makes sense to try and apply those principles to the system as a whole, rather than looking at each particular tax in isolation in those respects.
George?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I'd just like to ask Professor Gallagher this question. Last year he brought out a paper on progressive federalism, and he spoke about, it was obviously about creating a more progressive Scotland. Things have moved on and changed, obviously, with the COVID crisis, but you talked about empowering UK nations and regions in order to create that progressive Scotland. Now, I'm trying to work out, is there not an argument for that now, as we look at economic recovery in Scotland, that we look to empowering UK nations and regions so that they can actually deal with the situations in their area with these extra powers?
Good point. Fair point. I think that my own view, and this is not particularly COVID related and not related especially to the present crisis, is that there does need to be a bit of a rebalancing of the powers across the UK for all the devolved regions, and actually the regions of England, so that the UK becomes a bit more federal. And I'm delighted you've read that paper, and you'll remember the list of powers in it, most of which weren't actually fiscal. They were constitutional rather than fiscal, and included, as it happens, the idea that there might be a degree of capacity for the devolved administrations to enter in relation to devolved matters, concordats or agreements with the European Union. So yes, I do think we should pursue that set of ideas anyway. I don't think it's really a set of fiscal ideas that are the important ones there. It's about the embedding of devolution in the UK's hideously unwritten and untidy constitution.
And
George,
can I ask?
Sorry, when you go.
Sorry, I was just going to ask one final question to both individuals. Is there not a potential for a double whammy in Scotland as we move forward? And to explain it further, with the reserves function not providing adequate support for the Scottish economy, and I know some of the members might disagree with that, but if we look at it, there may be a conflict with the idea of support for the Scottish economy. And secondly, there could be the second part of the double whammy, higher block grant adjustments in future, which could have an effect on our budgeting in future as well. So, what would be your opinion on that? Is there a potential double whammy here for Scotland?
John, you want to pick that up first?
Sorry, I'm not totally sure I understand where the double whammy comes in, but I mean, clearly there will be very difficult problems to deal with. But
I think.
No, please. What I'm trying to say is it's on the effect of the fact that some of the reserve functions may not be what Scotland needs for economic recovery, and that be the first part of the because obviously UK government will be looking towards UK needs and what they're looking at, so there could be conflict there. And the second part of the double whammy would be effective that the higher block grant adjustments in future that could actually affect our budgeting as well.
I think to put that, George, I think what you're meaning there is, if the measures taken by the UK government create greater economic activity in the rest of the UK compared with Scotland, then that may well have an impact on the BGA later, and therefore.
Yes, that's what I said, Convener.
Okay, right, John, does that help?
Yeah, I mean, I guess really that depends on the extent to which the actions taken by the UK government have have a differential effect, have an unfavourable differential effect on Scotland? Or in other words, to what extent is the Scottish economy affected more than the rest of the UK that isn't properly kind of reflected in what the UK government's doing? And I'm not sure I can see that differential at the moment. I mean, obviously our expertise is on the tax side. I can see, as I pointed to earlier, that in terms of the income support levels, there are kind of gaps there, which I think are reasonably explicable by how quickly those schemes needed to be put together and how quickly they could get the help. And I can definitely see those gaps affecting people in Scotland, but I can't see a differential effect from what I've been able to identify so far, to be honest.
Okay, Jim?
I'm reminded of the argument that if we could have ham and eggs. If we'd eggs, if two things that might happen did happen, then they would both have happened. On the macroeconomic side, Scotland is, in macroeconomic terms, broadly typical of the UK. It's about now the third or fourth richest region, I think the fourth. And typically, Scottish macroeconomic variables are around the UK average. So there's no a priori reason to assume that the UK's macroeconomic responses would be any better or worse for Scotland than they were for the UK as a whole. It would be obviously important to remember that when we talk about the UK, we're talking about a country which includes Scotland. It's not a different country from Scotland. I think the striking thing for Mr. Adam is not to look at the potential future differential performance of the Scottish economy, but to look at the actual differential performance of the Scottish economy over the last decade or so. And the actual differential performance of the Scottish economy over the last decade has been consistently negative. Over the last decade, we have done less well in promoting economic growth than the rest of the UK has. And that contrasts with every decade before that from the 1960s onwards. In the 1960s, Scotland was one of the poorest regions of the United Kingdom. By the time of devolution in 1999, it was the third richest region of the United Kingdom. Since about 2008 or so, depending on which sets of numbers one looks at, per capita economic growth in Scotland has consistently underperformed the UK, but for the decades before it, it consistently outperformed the UK. So rather than wondering, if I may say so, of what might happen, what bad things might happen in the future, perhaps be better to ask ourselves, why is it that we haven't done so well over the last decade or so?
Okay, I'm going to move on, George, because I'm recognising time-wise here, we're getting a bit of a challenge. So, Alec Rowley?
Yeah, convener, thank you. In terms of looking forward, I mean, it strikes me that the level of uncertainty and unknown is great. We are still, George mentioned, as we come out of this crisis, we're still very much in this crisis, and most of the medical profession reckon that we will see a phase 2 of the virus. So with that level of uncertainty and moving forward in terms of 2021 and this budget gap that exists, what would you think, Professor Gallagher, that if we face this 600 million gap that is there, and goodness knows what else as we come into next year, what is the options for the Scottish Government? I mean, what powers can we look at using? Seem to rule out additional borrowing, and sitting alongside that, a number of people, including yourself, have said that because of the high level of public sector in Scotland, that we could be isolated from the economic crisis. But if we, as we saw for the global crisis and the austerity that followed that, then we could be more vulnerable if we start to see an austerity agenda that sees massive cutbacks in public services and therefore jobs. So what is the options for the Scottish Government, looking at in terms of the budget gap and looking at in terms of our over-reliance on the public sector?
I think that was to you, Jim.
Okay, those are really difficult questions. First, I think that the way the fiscal framework is designed, just to focus in detail on the Scottish budget for a minute, is advantageous to the extent that it gives the Scottish Government spending certainty in each individual year. So you don't find yourself in the current year facing budget reductions because tax has gone down. And obviously we need to keep that. You rightly refer, Mr. Rowley, to the what I'll call the income tax overhang, and that's a problem. And absent a crisis, it would be a problem which the Scottish budget would, I think, simply have to deal with, and it would be very painful. Present a problem, and given, as I said earlier, that the argument against having counter-cyclical reduction in expenditure in the middle of a crisis is quite strong, I think St Andrews House has a good argument for going to the Treasury and saying, can we have a flexibility here? As I said in my answer to Murdo Fraser, they might have to give up something in return for that. They might have to negotiate around the fiscal framework to get that capacity. To be fair to all the governments, actually worldwide at the moment, nobody's talking about austerity yet. We will have to pay back this borrowed money sometime. I hope that nobody's thinking of cutting expenditure to pay it back anytime soon, because the counter-cyclical effect of that would be very bad indeed.
So is there...
Sorry, I was going to let John come in that first, Alec, if he wants to say anything. Apologies.
I suppose the only observation I'd make is, I remember very well the debates that took place after 2008 and 2010 and so on about austerity. And I think at one time there was almost a kind of press media frenzy in favour of austerity at the UK level. And the balance of opinion this time, it seems much more preponderant in favour of letting the economy recover. And indeed, you regularly see calls for tax cuts. I don't know how realistic all of those calls are, but the balance of political and media comment seems very different now till then. And indeed, I think earlier this week, 3 former UK Chancellors of the Exchequer, Alastair Darling and 2 of his successors, gave evidence to the UK Treasury Committee, and I think there was a surprising degree of unanimity among them in saying how important it was to not harm the recovery before one made these adjustments. So, for what it's worth, I think there is some apparent difference in the climate of the balance of people's comments.
Sorry, Alec, back to you.
Given where we are in terms of a crisis, what is the opportunities for looking at other sources of income and revenue? Not everybody's done badly at this. Down the road for me in Dunfermline, we have a massive Amazon factory. They've certainly, I think, done well out of this. There's also the opportunities, or is there the opportunities for a wealth tax? Remember, a previous government introduced a windfall tax on the utilities. So what options are there for government? And looking at the role of the state, I noticed this morning in the Herald, there was a report that there was 25,000 vacancies, job vacancies in the economy across Scotland at the current time. But many of those vacancies was in areas such as health, social care and education, with obviously massive declines in retail, entertainment, hospitality. So what is the role of the state in looking at the economy, looking at where it's shrinking, and looking at intervention with skills, reskilling, training? Do we need to see a different type of economy, and what is the role of the state in getting people prepared for that?
John, you want to pick up this first? John go first, because of
briefly, I think in terms of Scotland's powers over tax, really it's income tax is the biggest issue, and clearly there are limits to what one can do. I mean, if you look back in history where you've had big debt spikes, and what do you do about them in terms of the Napoleonic and the first two world wars, and as well as the financial crisis, there've been, even just those four examples, there have been radically different ways of dealing with them each time, and many of them have included new levels of tax and new approaches to tax. I agree. I mean that'll be a big political debate, I'm sure, that will be occasioned by the levels of debt we're going to see coming out of the crisis.
Jim, on you
go. I think I would say Alec Rowley raises an important and long-term question here. We're going to move into a world in which the economy is a bit smaller and the state's a bit bigger. And the state's going to be bigger because it's going to do more things. It's going to do more in the provision of health. It should, in my view, do more and spend more in the provision of social care, which is an issue which has been thrown into awful relief in the present crisis. That means more taxes. Quite a lot of those will be UK taxes, and that's good news for Scotland in that the UK tax base on the whole is slightly stronger than the Scottish tax base, so we get, as it were, some of the side benefit of that. If there are income tax rises in England, there'll be pressure under the fiscal framework for income tax rises in Scotland. But in Scotland, we've got some other options too. First of all, there's local taxation. The reform of the absence of the reform of the council tax over 20 years is scandalous. The fact that we're still using 1991 house values is appalling, and the persistent unwillingness to grasp that nettle is deeply problematic, and it offers, particularly because a tax on physical property is the nearest thing that exists in the UK to a tax on wealth. So there's some opportunities there. The Scottish Parliament also has a power to create new taxes if it wants to. There are one-off or consistent new taxes that it could think about inventing. And perhaps most awkwardly of all, maybe we have to question, after decades under which all of our political parties, or most of them, have been determined to make stuff free, public services without charge, whether it's actually wise to, as it were, refuse to take the contributions of those who can afford to make some contribution towards the cost of the services they get. So there are options on the table, but none of them is at all easy.
Yeah. And finally, Convener, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Scottish Government published a paper this week on Brexit, and their analysis is that if we end up with a no-deal Brexit or something close to that, and not with close alignment to the customs union and the European market, it will just add massively to the economic crisis that we're facing. I wonder what's your thoughts on that?
Just before we go into that answer, and it's a good question, I'm just conscious of time, folks, so if we could just try to tighten our questions a bit, our questions and answers a wee bit. I know it's a bit unfair on the others who are coming, but I'm conscious of the time here. If you could do your best, as far as the witnesses are concerned, to be as succinct as you can, I'd be most grateful. But Jim, on you go.
Let me just say very briefly in response to Mr. Rowley's question, adding further economic disruption on top of the economic disruption caused with this crisis by driving towards a hard Brexit in the hope that it will somehow be disguised by the COVID crisis would be not just unwise but wicked.
Thank you. John, and just to give broadcasting the heads up, after this I'm going straight to John Mason.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay, in that case we're going to John Mason. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much, Convener. Sorry, are you hearing me? Thanks, Convener.
We're here.
To take up the point about, I mean, income tax on the whole doesn't affect us immediately. However, there is the related issue that if Westminster departments find money in place of consequentials, it could be hit within the year. And I'm really wondering, well, is there a danger of that? I mean, we've already seemed to have had the issue of consequentials being indicated and then being told we don't get them because they're within the Westminster department. So I'm just wondering if there's a real risk for us in that.
And who are you putting that to, John?
Well, I think, sorry, John Cullinan does mention it in his 3.6 in his paper.
Okay. John, we'll go to you first.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure I heard that well, but I think that when there are differential effects or differential decisions, there can always be anomalies within the formula. I mean, there can be both swings and roundabouts. Overall, I would agree with what Professor Gallagher said earlier about the kind of the big picture of the Barnett formula. I mean, clearly there are particular risks when particular decisions or developments take place, and the adjustment works disproportionately.
Jim?
I don't think there's a big risk here. There's sometimes what you might call a bit of noise around this as people maybe get the wrong end of the stick. As far as I can see, the Treasury has been punctilious in its calculation of Barnett consequentials, including consequentials in year, largely because perhaps they get a terrible amount of grief if they don't do it properly. I mean, one of the interesting issues which will come up, I suspect, and you might want to reflect on this as a committee, is the pressure which will, I think, emerge for the Scottish Government to spend Barnett consequentials on the places that generate them, rather than simply as the rules allow that they can spend it where they like. So health would be an obvious example for that. I expect there will be substantial ongoing increases in the health budget in England. They will produce substantial health consequentials for the Scottish bloc. There will be no formal hypothecation of those because there isn't under Barnett, but the committee might want to consider whether it would strongly encourage the Scottish Government to invest in health, which is something which it hasn't done successfully over the last decade.
Jim, can I just pick up on that last point? Because
I mean,
sorry, John, apologies. I'm going to have one quick supplementary here on that last point on health. Because it's my understanding that all of the consequentials that the Scottish Government have had in regard to the health budget have been passed on. Is that not the case?
I could bore for written on this one, convener, but the answer is no. If you look over the decades since 2011, if health consequentials had gone to the NHS budget in Scotland, the health budget would have been about £1 billion a year higher than it currently is. Some of that was diverted into free personal care, and some of it was diverted into other priorities such as policing, but it did not go to the NHS.
Sorry, John, to interrupt you there.
John? No, that's okay, that's fine. I mean, I still, despite the answers, I still have concerns that there's uncertainty around some of these consequentials. And if the consequentials don't match what the Scottish Government is expecting in the current year, they are going to have to try and do something to match that. And I just wonder if either of the witnesses can suggest how the Scottish Government could possibly do that other than getting more borrowing powers.
John, Jim, Jim, do you want to pick that up?
Okay. I'm not absolutely clear about the underlying assumption of the question, which is that if the Scottish Government expects to get something in year as a bonus, as it were, and doesn't get it, it's then got a problem. It's merely overestimated the amount it's going to get. One of the disappointments of the handling of the fiscal framework was perhaps not unexpectedly, one of the things the Scottish Government has not done is build up a cash reserve to deal with contingencies of anything like the scale it might have done. Perhaps if it had, it would have been easier to deal with the kind of problem Mr Mason anticipates were that problem to happen, but I don't actually know that it's happened.
Yeah, but there's also a political reality in all of that, Jim, in terms of the pressure put on by the opposition to spend, and by government backbenchers to spend every penny available in public services has been a reality. So listen, I'm going to. John, are you finished? John Mason.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, in that case, Alexander Burnett.
Oh gosh.
Thank you, Convener. This is a question for Professor Gallagher. Much of a discussion so far has been about the relationship between the UK and Scottish governments, but you do have you did touch on the revenue position of local government in your submission, and you did mention local taxation in your answer to Alex Rowley. So can I ask, what challenges do you see here for local governments, and more importantly, what solutions? And I note already you commented on the out-of-date valuation rule.
Thanks, Mr. Burnett. I'm, as they say, glad you asked that question. Local government has been very much the poor relation of Scottish public finance for a long time now. It has had systematically its fiscal autonomy reduced and constrained, and its funding has been more squeezed over recent years than the Scottish bloc as a whole. So it starts from quite a difficult place. Two issues, I think, are particularly difficult just now. One is the funding of care for the elderly, and I think we all see, and this is, I'm not making any sense of partisan point here, that we've collectively neglected the care sector, and we'll have to rectify that, and that's an issue that goes back a very long time. As for local government more generally, I am quite concerned about the possibility that the loss of revenue, particularly in areas like leisure and recreation, which depend very substantially on people paying their money at the swimming pool, at the gymnasium and so on, or at the entertainment venue. And those are often carried out in arm's length trusts or such like bodies for reasons largely connected with value-added tax. This could put very substantial pressure on council budgets at a time when they're not going to have any money. So that will be another demand on the Scottish Government, there's no doubt about that. In the medium term, I think we need a reformed and more effective system of local taxation that will actually raise some more money. We've squeezed council tax, and council tax is anything but a perfect tax, but it's the tax we've got, and we've squeezed it hard for a very long time, and that has left councils in a bad state. I know you convener have experience as a council leader, and councils are very, very good at managing their budgets. Actually, they've had to be. But we can't go on like this indefinitely. So we need to give them some more tax capacity, and we probably need to give them some more actual support, particularly in relation to health and social care.
Thank you. And same sort of question for John, but also about local government, but also more pertinently, you mentioned there was a low awareness in Scotland about the fiscal framework. But I note that your primary purpose is to promote education in taxation. So I was just wondering how successful you think you are in achieving this in Scotland.
Well, clearly we've got a long way to go, both in Scotland and in the UK as a whole. But we have quite a complicated structure of tax to deal with, I have to say.
Thank you.
Okay, Patrick.
Thank you, convener, and good afternoon to our witnesses. In some ways, there's been a lot of talk about uncertainty, and uncertainty isn't anything new. We always have to set budgets and plan for the possibility that we might have to face a crisis. So in some ways, we have more certainty knowing that we definitely do have to face a crisis. What do the witnesses anticipate by way of further measures from the UK government around providing a recovery package? Jim has already talked about the prospect of higher taxation and more borrowing at cheap levels at the moment. There is also the prospect of money creation being part of the picture of a recovery stimulus package that many governments around the world are looking at, and the UK government may do as well. To what extent would that flow through to additional flexibility for the Scottish government, or would we simply have to accept that all of that control stays with the UK government? And how indeed does it fit with the tax picture here? I'm pleased that Jim Gallagher has talked so much about the long-standing failure of the Scottish Parliament and Scottish governments to reform the local tax system. But is that still an opportunity in the current context? Is it possible to deliver the kind of reforms to local taxation could achieve a more effective wealth tax, for example, as well as higher tax revenues? Or have we missed the boat? Have we missed the opportunity to do that work, given the scale of political response that's focused elsewhere?
Sorry, John, you want to pick that up first?
I suppose, to my mind, so far the responses of the UK government have been at the larger end than one might have anticipated, given past crises and past track records. So the level of and the speed of income support, and then secondarily, the extent to which they're clearly looking at winding that down very gradually and putting a premium on keeping the economy going and not on withdrawing that subsequently. And also the balance, as I mentioned earlier, of political and media debate seems much more in favour of measures to keep the economy going rather than dealing with giving early priority to the fiscal problems that arise. I'd have to accept that I don't think you can read across to that anything particular about the level of autonomy that might be greater autonomy that might be agreed with Scotland. It might just be, you're hoping, as it were, for more of those favourable consequentials, because there are going to be decisions Westminster either which that directly affect Scotland beneficially, or which create favourable consequentials. I think the jury's out as regards anything as regards negotiation. I mean, in terms of new taxes, I agree that nothing much has happened on the council tax. I mean, it's not that different from the situation in England, to be quite honest. I mean, one of the difficulties I think about grasping the nettle there is that council tax is one of the few taxes that the ordinary person actually physically pays as a kind of discrete and chunky amount, rather than have withheld from them at source or wrapped up with something larger. And so I think it's always been kind of more visible and more subject to popularity issues. But there is a nettle, I suppose, that has to be granted there, has to be grasped there. In terms of wealth taxes, which have come up a couple of times, there has been a bit of a view grown up that other than on property, it's very hard to contemplate those things. There has been a trend of moving away from wealth taxes internationally, most recently in France, and there's a bit of a view that the wealthy are so mobile that is there just anything you can do about that? I mean, on the other hand, we do see unprecedented levels of exchange of information between tax authorities now, and cooperation between tax authorities, even when the political stance of the governments is different. So it may be that some of the kind of views as to why that's not possible or not feasible may need to be revisited. Given that this is a crisis that's affecting very many countries, and that there has been more global cooperation on tax than there has been probably ever historically before.
Jim?
First of all, I think as for the UK government's actions, I very much agree with John with that the extent to which the UK government has spent money, I think probably has surprised itself. I think they have been, by international standards, the interventions are really very large. You asked me to forecast, you asked us to forecast what's coming. I think the interesting, that would be good, wouldn't it? I think the interesting thing is how will this level of debt be managed and repaid in due course? I think we'll see a mixture of things. We will certainly see a mixture of some monetary policy interventions. They've already started, actually. There's no doubt about that. And those monetary policy interventions will end up with the Bank of England buying some of the UK government gilts in order to buy corporate bonds, etc. And that will, in effect, monetize the UK's debt. So some of it will go that way. There's a risk that some of it will go through inflation. It may be that the monetary regime will stop that, but traditionally that's an obvious response to high debt. Some of it will go on higher taxes. Some of them, I think, may be windfall taxes. And of course, if I could tell you what those were, I wouldn't, because people would then hide their money and not pay them. So when you're doing a windfall tax, you have to be quick. But some of it will have to be sustained ongoing taxation to support both the repayment and the continued increase in public service spending that I expect to result in this crisis. But the big unanswered question is the mechanisms which the UK government will use to support the microeconomic mechanisms the UK government will use to support and intervene in individual companies. We've got a lot of companies that are on life support just now. They're living on government loans, their staff are furloughed, their prospects aren't great, particularly if the sectors that they're in are the ones which are likely to be adversely affected. I wouldn't invest in a pub or a nightclub just now, because they're not going to be very busy for a long time. And we need to think through the mechanisms of supporting those who can be supported and reallocating that resource of the people who work in those areas to other areas of the economy, some of which will be in the public sector. And there, as I said in my note to the committee, the immediate challenge for the Scottish Government is to get as close as it can beside the UK Government in understanding and influencing their thinking on that, so there can be a coordinated response by agencies like Scottish Enterprise and the new Scottish National Investment Bank, along with the UK Government approach. None of us yet knows what these approaches is going to be.
Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you. The other question I wanted to explore is on the ability, to what extent the Scottish Government has the ability to ensure that recovery is equitable, socially just, that it results in a more equal rather than less equal economy. We've already had, for example, the argument that principles like the ability to pay should apply to the tax system as a whole rather than to each individual tax. That would imply the need to reverse the long-standing injustice that lower income people pay a higher proportion of their income in overall tax than the wealthier part of society do. We've had the example of tax-motivated incorporation, which is an option available to people, most of whom have higher than average income, available as an option to very, very few low-income people. Again, that's an ability, an anomaly within the current system that that benefits the well-off to the expense of everybody else. I'm really looking for the view of the witnesses. To what extent does the Scottish Government have the ability to ensure that we're protecting lower income people, women, marginalised communities, younger people who've been at the brunt of the economic impact so far? To what extent can we actually avoid that in the future recovery?
You want me to pick up this first, and we can make these as succinct as we can, folks, in terms of answers. Grateful. Jim?
Sorry. Important questions. I think the biggest single shift that will happen, and which the Scottish Government will take its part in, is that the state will be a bigger share of the economy. And by and large, activity by the state promotes more social justice than activity by the market. So that in itself should help the perfectly valid points that Mr. Harvey raises.
John?
Well, I think I mentioned, as Mr. Harvey said, I mentioned the different treatment of incorporated and unincorporated businesses before, and that's something that I think could be looked at. And Professor Gallagher, I think, mentioned the local authority finance and earlier as well. So I think there are examples that could be gone and looked at fairly early on. I mean, no doubt there's always more, but I think there are things that could be addressed.
Listen, can I thank our witnesses very much for today? It's an hour and a half now we've been asking you questions, and I'm very grateful for your input. I'm going to suspend the meeting now for 5 minutes to allow a changeover of witnesses to our second session. Again, thank you, and we'll now suspend. Good afternoon and welcome to our second panel involving Mark Taylor, who's the Auditor Director of Audit Scotland, and David Phillips, who's the Associate Director at the Institute of Fiscal Studies. I warmly welcome both Mark and David to our meeting, and I thank you very much for your submissions. And can I remind members, because of the time we're at here and our panel of witnesses, can we keep our questions as succinct and our answers as succinct as we can, please? And can I also remind members that when we are putting a question to the members to the panel, can we identify who that question is going to first? That will help our broadcasting team. And with that being said, I'm going to turn for the first question to Donald Cameron. Donald.
Thank you, convener. My question is for David Phillips. Mr. Phillips, in your submission, you make reference to a forecast reduction in funding of approximately £600 million in the coming years due to various reconciliations. Would it be fair to say, as I think you do, that even before the pandemic, as a result of these reconciliations and wider budgetary decisions taken by the Scottish Government, that the maximum borrowing limits have already been exceeded?
So, yes. In principle, the Scottish Government has access to up to £600 million a year of borrowing for forecast shortfalls or sort of arised output shortfalls in revenues. But the full £600 million is only available in the case of a Scotland-specific shock. And that means that the Scottish economy must grow by less than 1%, and the economy must grow by 1% less than the rest of the UK. Now, I think it's quite likely that the Scottish economy will grow by less than 1%. It's not clear whether it will grow by 1% less than the UK. So with that, if that isn't the case, if you can't access the kind of additional borrowing a Scotland-specific shock allows you to, that means borrowing is capped at £300 million. And you can also draw down approximately £150 million from the Scotland Reserve. And that means that there could be a shortfall of around £150 million, I think, in the next financial year related to the sort of reconciliations of the block grant adjustments.
Okay. I'm not sure how much of the previous session you heard, but Professor Gallagher was asked about borrowing powers, and his view, as he expressed it, was that question was premature, I think he said, and he gave reasons for that. He said that the UK government has in effect injected large amounts of money into Scotland, both directly through the furlough scheme and indirectly through Barnett consequentials. And he also pointed to the ability of the UK government to borrow at negative interest rates. And it's a question to both witnesses, do you agree or disagree with that analysis?
Well, I don't think the question of borrowing powers is too premature at the moment. I think there is, what the borrowing powers are not designed, they're never designed to make up for long-term shortfalls or declines in Scottish revenues. Borrowing isn't an appropriate response to sort of a secular decline in Scotland's revenues. The extent to which the deterioration in revenues compared to forecasts reflects a long-term decline, that wasn't what borrowing power is for. You'll need to make an adjustment to spending if your revenues are coming in consistently lower than forecast, and really to make sure the forecasts are better going forwards. But it's not just the issue of the sort of potential economic effects of COVID-19 on tax revenues. And Jim Gallagher is right that things like the furlough scheme will support tax revenues to a significant extent, as will the large share of public sector employment in Scotland, will help Scottish revenues hold up reasonably well on the income tax side. But one doesn't also need to borrow potentially for forecast errors for the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. It can also be a role for borrowing to fund policy measures in the short term. So one of the issues with the current regime is that there is no potential even for short-term borrowing to fund additional policy measures. So if the Scottish Government wants to spend more on COVID-19 responses, if the impact of COVID-19 in certain areas is higher in Scotland than it is elsewhere in the UK, the Scottish Government doesn't have the option to borrow to fund those measures. It has to wait and see what funding it gets through the Barnett consequentials, which might take longer, and the Scottish Government might consider it not sufficient for the measures it wants to take in Scotland. So that's why in my submission in sort of publication put out at the start of this back at the end of March, we suggested considering whether temporarily relaxing these fiscal rules to allow borrowing by the Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish governments for not only forecast errors, but also for short-term spending measures as well. And we have seen a number of OECD countries, for example, Spain, relaxing its borrowing rules for subnational government. And the OECD has suggested it's worthwhile considering relaxing rules to give more flexibility during the sort of, the crisis phase, as well as some of the longer term, recovery and consolidation phases.
Does Mr. Taylor want to come in here?
No, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'll avoid, for reasons you'll understand in terms of the audit role, a direct view on what the measures and fiscal framework should be and what the limits should be. A couple of observations about how that operates. I think one of the things that's absolutely the case in the current environment is that the uncertainty, the volatility, the complexity that was in the Scottish budget before and was beginning to play through as a result of things like the tax reconciliations and the like, is absolutely amplified, and it's amplified very quickly in the short term. And there's something about how Scottish Government is able to manage that in the short term and as the effects play through in future years. I think the borrowing powers are one of the basket of things that are available. I think often the focus is on how can we maintain our current spending plans in this environment, and that's understandable. And of course, the Cabinet Secretary is looking for additional flexibilities and some certainty around some of the funding that's there. But I think increasingly the discussion also needs to be about the way in which the budget is made up and the way in which the budget is formulated, and where the slack in the budget might be to be able to turn down some activity to accommodate new pressures as they play through, and to do that more quickly and be able to design that into the budget more quickly. Absolutely recognise the challenge in pulling back on expenditure. I think in the short-term environment, I think in the summer budget revision, we already see some examples with things that were expected to be able to go ahead that are not currently able to go ahead, and that provides an additional degree of flexibility to deploy elsewhere. And we've seen that around, for example, the Social Security programme costs, where unfortunately there's been some slight delays in that, but that's freed up some funding to be used elsewhere. And I think inevitably we'll get into a period of some pretty tough decisions around budget choices, and there's something almost irrespective of the extent of flexibility that might be forthcoming, that those decisions will still be there in the short term and as the government goes on into the future, and clarity over that will be really important.
Thank you, Convener. Those are all my questions.
In which case we'll now go to Alec Rowley, which will be followed, once Alec's concluded, by the Help Broadcasting, John Mason now.
Thank you, Convener. I just one question in this session. It is looking at local government. Local government, obviously, on the front line, had major difficult financial decisions that they were having to make before this. Pressures are even greater now. We know that Scotland tends to advise local authorities that they must have a certain level of reserves. Given the current situation, would you continue to insist that local authorities keep a certain level of reserves? And what powers do you think that local authorities could increase? Borrowing powers, for example, or any other revenue raising powers that they could use to get us through this next period of time?
Thanks, which member would you like to go to first, Alec? We must remember to point the...
Mark Taylor would be.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely recognise that the pressure on all public services and government at this time, and also recognise that the way in which local government finances work is somewhat different to the way in which the Scottish Government's finances work. We talked in this session and before with the committee, which to some extent the Scottish Government is protected from changes in tax and income as a result of the way in which block grant adjustments play through. To some extent that's the case for local government too, in the way that the Scottish Government provides non-domestic rates. The big form of local government funding is non-domestic rates, and essentially the Scottish Government covers the tax, the risk around that the tax takes less than was expected. And we've seen again in the summer budget revision how some of the funding flowing from the UK Government has been deployed to underwrite reductions expected as a result of the reliefs around NDR. What is different, however, is the extent of reliance that local government has on income from charges, and we heard in the previous session around leisure facilities and the like, and they're more directly exposed to that. There's not that same kind of buffer against those things. What local government does have, of course, as I've really said, is an ability to deploy reserves, and the reserves are for a rainy day, and it's certainly raining currently, would be the observation that I would make. And only use reserves once, and you can't underpin your ongoing expenditure plan by those use of reserves. So there's a big challenge in there for local government. On Audit Scotland, we've never said what the right level of reserve should be. Recognition of a judgment for individual councils, and that will continue to be the case. But as part of councils' overall plans, they'll want to look at the options around that. And similarly, there's a range of perhaps other revenue raising options, none of which are comfortable and none of which are straightforward. But public services across the Scottish public sector will be facing those tough budget decisions as a result of COVID, on top of what was already a quite tough environment.
David?
So I must admit I know a little bit less about the sort of reserve levels and the kind of revenue makeup of Scottish local authorities than I do of English local authorities. But I would kind of echo what Mark was saying there. There can be a particular issue on sales fees and charges, because it's not only with business rates there's a sort of a degree of protection. The way the accounting works on council tax is a sort of what's called a collection fund, and then the general fund, and that sort of means actually many of the impacts of the council tax, any reductions in council tax receipts, sort of are treated as a separate accounting exercise in the current year, and then kind of feed through into the general fund next year, actually, when councils have to update, the amounts they've drawn down from their collection fund. I think one of the interesting things from analysis looking at in England is that, at least in terms of the revenue side of things, the impacts of COVID-19 seem to be larger actually on the revenue side than on the spending side in the current financial year, at least, is that perhaps surprisingly it's not necessarily the kind of most deprived areas that are being likely to be hit harder by the sort of immediate financial hits of COVID-19. It's actually quite often the affluent areas where they raise more through sales fees and charges income, and especially through council tax. And again, perhaps surprisingly, whilst we know that lower income households are more likely to be working in sectors affected by lockdown and sort of the social distancing policies, hospitality, retail, etc., actually many of those jobs are concentrated in sort of the less deprived areas, which are often, where the nicer places for tourists to visit. So the point I was making there is that in the short term, you might expect that some of the areas where the local authorities hit hardest will actually be in the areas you traditionally perhaps worry a bit less about, the sort of more affluent, less deprived parts of Scotland. That's certainly a pattern we like to see in England, at least. Going ahead, though, it looks like the areas of the country that are more likely to be potentially hit on the kind of like longer term impacts on sort of demands due to the sort of the social and health and other impacts of lockdown, they will be concentrated more in the deprived areas. So ill health, housing problems, mental health issues, safeguarding issues, those tend to be actually concentrated in more deprived communities. You might expect there to be sort of a bigger impact in more deprived areas later on as those effects become become more serious. Now, in England, at least, we noted that whilst reserves levels, the authorities look like they're to be hit harder in the short term, tend to have higher reserves. There could be some authorities which have both kind of potentially large impacts on their revenues and potentially the costs, but also have quite low reserves. And again, we suggested considering the potential for kind of short-term borrowing for resource spending to kind of go alongside the kind of prudential regime that local authorities have on capital spending could be something that's worth considering.
Yeah, Alec, another question, or is that you happy?
Thank you.
Okay, John Mason, please. Thanks, Alec.
Thanks very much, Convener. A couple of things. Firstly, reading your papers, maybe start with David Phillips. Scotland has received 3.5 billion, but only passed on 3.4 billion. Whereas Mark Taylor in the Audit Scotland paper, it says Scotland's received 3.6 billion, but spent 4 billion. So these don't quite tie in with each other. Can David maybe explain, or Mark?
So I should say that I took my figures from a SPICE briefing note, which was produced at the start of May. So it could be the case that that's been updated, the figures have been updated since then. I think there have been some small additional Barnett consequentials, so for example, the additional funding for social care and some other measures announced since then. And the Scottish Government could have announced further spending measures. I should say it wouldn't surprise me if they've gone further than the Barnett consequentials. In Wales, we saw the Welsh Government announce additional measures on top of what they received through Barnett, funded by reallocating EU funds from sort of business development to business survival, and by sort of deprioritising certain areas of spending, things that couldn't go ahead or have lower returns in the current environment. So some sort of like trade and investment promotion, some road safety measures, etc. So it wouldn't surprise me if the Scottish Government, in announcing further measures, has started to think about reallocation of resources as well as using Barnett consequences, because that is also happening within England as well. Within the departmental budgets in England, there are reallocations as well as new money.
To help you, David, there were quite a lot of reallocations and extra money announced towards the end of May, so I'm sure Mark can pick up on that.
Yeah,
Mark?
Thank you, Convener, and question. Essentially, it's a timing issue, as David said there. Figures we've used are from the summer budget revision. I think the underlying issue is this emphasises how dynamic this is and will continue to be. I think that one of the features in the environment we're in at the moment is that having nice, clear-cut fiscal events, difficult though that might have been in the past, a number of predefined areas through the year, it's much more of a running response here. And in the same way as the Scottish Government has challenges managing its budget at a UK budget level, that will be going on as well. And they have that interaction playing through between the two governments.
John, you got anything else?
Yes, another point, if I may. Also in the Audit Scotland submission, it's paragraph 26, it talks about the risk of negative Barnett consequentials. Now, I asked the previous witnesses about this, and they seemed to feel there wasn't much risk within the year. But I had kind of got the gut feeling from the government that they were a bit uncertain as to how much is coming in consequentials, and therefore there is a risk that they overcommit effectively in the current year, in which case they would have to make savings in the current year. So I'm really wondering, Mark, especially, how big is the risk in this area?
Thank you. And so I would certainly recognise the risk around this. I think I said at the outset that the increased volatility, complexity and uncertainty and playing through in the current year, and that's absolutely the case. Different judgments on how that fits in the grand scheme of things, but absolutely in an environment, to go back to the point I made just a second ago, in an environment where the UK government is also trying to manage their way through this, and I think the word punctilious was used previously, and I recognise that as well, but things move around and change a lot, and we'd expect that to continue. I think last year, in the last financial year, in the 1920 financial year, we all got a bit of a surprise with a downward Barnett consequential, but that is how Barnett works. It works both ways, and it works on the basis of the budget adjustments that the UK government is making. So in the circumstances where the UK government is funding additional spending as a result of COVID-19 from essentially reductions elsewhere or activity that is no longer happening elsewhere, that will play through those Barnett consequentials. I think the main challenge from a Scottish Government perspective is understanding that uncertainty, doing what it can to eliminate it as far as possible, and I understand the efforts have been made around that, but it is a feature of the current circumstance at the moment, and how it's one example of how that uncertainty in the short term is absolutely playing through now.
I think David wants to make a short contribution here as well. David?
Yes, the thing I was going to add was that one option, if the UK government was, for example, to say that some of the kind of planned spending is actually going to be funded via reallocations as opposed to new money, one option would be to follow the approach that it effectively took back in 2010 when it announced in-year budget cuts for UK government departments, where it gave the option for the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to defer those cuts into subsequent years. And that could be an option with this as well. So if it does sort of unwind some of the consequentials, which I'm not sure how high of risk that is, but if it did decide to do that, it could allow the Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish governments more time to make those changes, like it did in 2010.
Thank you. John, was that you? Thank you. Alexander Burnett, please.
Thank you, Convener. Now, my question was on the concerns and solutions of local government funding, and David's already given an extensive response in his answer to Alex Rowley. So I wonder if I could just develop the point Alex Rowley was making on, namely reserves, which is more of an audit question, I suppose, and it's really how financially secure do you see these councils? I mean, for instance, do they have some sort of credit rating, or how do you monitor that, and what sort of state would you say they're in? So I don't know if David's, first of all, if he's got anything to add to his previous answer, and then Mark.
I should say that I don't actually know the reserve levels for Scottish councils. In England, councils typically have reserves of around, in aggregate, about 30 to 40% of annual expenditure, which actually is a significant amount. I think the UK government is considering, actually initially said that it would, fund all the costs for Scottish councils. Now looking at the reserves levels and its own financial issues, I think it is now decided to let local authorities dip into the reserves to fund some of the costs. I think Mark would have a much better idea about what the sort of reserve levels are in Scottish authorities to see whether there's, similar scope in Scotland.
Yeah. And Mark?
A big question with a long, detailed answer, which of course we don't have time to go into. The overarching view around that is that the Accounts Commission, who works alongside Audit Scotland around local government, reports annually on the overall financial position of local government, and will continue to do so, and is obviously keeping a very close eye as things develop. The strains of local government are clear, and that's been reflected in that reporting. And the challenges that they face, and in addition to what their current position has been, are significant as a result of COVID, and there'll be a need for public services generally to work their way through the implications of that. And there's no underestimating for local government and for public services more generally the extent of the challenge that they're all facing at the moment. That short-term funding can get us so far, but the overriding environment is one where the extent of strain on the public finances and the overall ability to manage that is dialed up significantly as a result of COVID-19, and that applies to local government as much as it applies to the rest of the public sector.
Okay, that was Alexander's final question, and therefore we'll now go to Angela Constance.
Hello, Convener. Thank you. I just have one question, and that's for David Phillips. And I wonder if Mr. Phillips could explain how the lack of borrowing powers limits Scottish Government's ability to respond effectively to a crisis such as COVID. He touched upon this in his paper, and if he could explain how having more borrowing powers, how that could potentially help support economic recovery. And he also in his paper touched upon how things could be different, and he made some reference to practice within the OECD in terms of relaxing some budgetary rules. Thank you.
Yes, so I think the first thing I would say on this is that overall the sort of fiscal framework does provide a lot of insurance for the Scottish government's finances. I think this was covered quite extensively actually in the last session, so I won't say too much about it, but the combination of block grant funding and the block grant adjustments provide a lot of insurance to the Scottish government for falls in tax revenues as a result of the financial effects of COVID-19. UK government bears the costs of UK taxes, which are still, sort of over half tax revenues from Scotland, and the sort of fiscal framework, the block grant adjustments mean that the impacts on Scotland are delayed, but also Scotland only bears the relative risk of those impacts. So a lot of support is provided via those mechanisms. Now, we talked about, I think earlier a bit about the extent to which sometimes the rules, even for sort of forecast, borrowing to kind of cope with forecast shortfalls in revenues, the rules on those are quite constrained, with the idea of the Scotland-specific shock playing a role in them. I think there's a role for relaxing that. We've seen that you don't just need, it's not only in cases where GDP has fallen relative to the UK that you can see tax revenues fall relative to the UK. Especially the impacts of sort of constant on high tax yielding sectors like the oil and gas sector. I think there's also a case for sort of looking at the borrowing rules and just updating them in line with tax revenue growth, because these revenues, these rules are fixed in 2016. Since when there's been growth in the underlying tax bases that should be indexed. So I think there's changes need to be made there. I think the biggest issue in the kind of short term, in the current crisis, though, has been that the borrowing powers are really for kind of one purpose, and that is, forecasts shortfalls in tax revenues or overspends on the demand-led welfare measures when those come in. They're not there to sort of provide additional sort of liquidity for the Scottish government to take additional policy measures. So it can't use borrowing to fund additional spending or to fund discretionary tax reductions as part of a fiscal stimulus. Now, I wrote that kind of initial piece on this kind of back at the kind of start of this issue in March, when it was quite clear that there was sort of some delays between the UK government having to announce its own policies that would confirm what the Scottish and Welsh governments would get through the Barnett formula, and then that allowed the Scottish government and the Welsh government to announce and cost their own measures. And my thinking on that is that effectively that is at a moment of kind of crisis, slowing down the sort of process of decision making. It can lead to sort of potentially constrained responses, delayed responses, and certainly sort of political difficulties for the Scottish and Welsh governments if they seem to be lagging the response in England. And that's just due to the fact they've got to wait for the English measures and the funding to come through before they can determine their own measures. So additional borrowing powers in the short term, at least, to kind of fund policy measures would avoid that problem. I think it also relates to the fact that the Barnett formula is used to allocate the additional funding from Westminster to Scotland. Barnett is a population-based formula, and the impacts on Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland may not be equivalent to the kind of population shares. And one option is to kind of reform Barnett to reflect that, so bypass the Barnett formula to kind of give more needs-based allocations. Again, another option is to kind of give the Scottish government and Welsh government and Northern Irish governments powers to borrow additional money if they want to respond. So I think kind of my response was kind of twofold. I think in the long term, there's a need to kind of consider what the rules are around sort of the existing borrowing regime for forecast revenue shortfalls. They're not flexible enough, and they need to grow in line with the tax base. But actually, the immediate issue now is borrowing for policy measures, which is completely disallowed. And I don't think you want to rush into making permanent changes to the fiscal framework at a time like this. So in the OECD and Spain, they're not changing the fiscal frameworks permanently. They're just, if you like, putting them to one side for now and saying, well, look, given this current crisis, for this period, we can have some additional flexibility. And I think it is worth considering that. I think, to be frank, that should be considered earlier on. That should be considered back in late March, early April. But I think it's still worth considering now, in case, for example, there's a further wave of cases or there's, further impacts, and that requires, further policy responses.
Thank you.
And I guess if you were listening to the last session around the Barnett formula questions, David, in terms of what Professor Gallagher said, we might expect some commentators to want a change to the Barnett formula, but it might be dangerous for Scotland. I just need that as a comment. Perhaps a bit wicked of me, but there you go. Jackie Bailey.
Very much, convener. My area of questioning is largely in the same place as Angela Constance's was, but there are going to be immediate impacts on the budget in this year. For example, the decrease in income from land and building transaction tax, the increase in expenditure in social security funding are just two examples of that. Now, I know there are mechanisms in place, but I'm wondering whether they are sufficient and whether there is sufficient headroom in the Scotland reserves and indeed in borrowing. And I wonder whether I could go to Mark Taylor first with that.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd absolutely start with a recognition that we talked earlier in the earlier session, there's some discussion about how arrangements around income tax meant that the hit from that, if there was to be one, would be down the line. But absolutely, in some areas of the budget, that those things will be experienced this year, particularly around the social security budget. The size of that budget, £3.5 billion, and the extent of uncertainty over the accuracy of those forecasts, given that there's no data set around that. And we've yet to experience how that plays through in a very early stage of that in the current year, and brings a degree of risk around that. The risk around the tax side's slightly less, given the relative size of LBTT. And as Jackie Bailey says, there is a kind of degree of dampening of whatever those effects are through the block grant adjustment mechanism. And at the heart of how that operates is the relative impact between what happens in Scotland around social security and around devolved taxes compared to equivalents in England and Northern Ireland, and how what the relative effects are. I think we've got into the habit of thinking as risk as all being one way. It's always bad, it's always down, it's always less, always costs more. And in terms of forecasting risk, that can go either way. And it will be how that, what those forecasters made of those numbers, and how things have changed from that in both of the economies since then, it will play through. The question was really about, have we got powers and the flexibility to deal with that? I think it's difficult. It's difficult to get a sense of that overall. I think others have talked about the degree of constraint around the aggregate effect of the reserves and the borrowing powers, and that is absolutely a thing. I think what I'd also recognise is that some of the decisions that have been made in previous years about when to borrow, what to do with the reserves, also carry through to the current year and need to be reflected in the decisions in the current year. And similarly, things that are done now by government and will carry forward into the future years. There is a big challenge in all of that. The uncertainty is significant. And I know that a lot of the discussion is about how the rules might be changed to accommodate that. Even if the rules are changed to a certain degree, I go back to my earlier point that a high degree of budget management will be required this year, both understanding what can be spent because the environment's very different and what might free up around that, but equally some hard decisions down the line about priorities, and recognising that in the budget it's a lot easier to turn certain things up and down as it is in others. Some costs are really committed, some things are easier to control in the short term, and I think increasingly discussion will be about that budget management and how how those judgments are made, and from our perspective, a real need for transparency around that, and transparency around these effects and the judgments that government are making around that, an opportunity for the committee and the Parliament as a whole to scrutinise that.
Okay, Jackie?
Thank you very much. That was a very helpful response. I wonder whether I could ask David Phillips basically a similar question. You talked about temporary relaxation of borrowing powers on the basis of policy delivery. But actually, isn't this just necessary for the current climate in which we find ourselves in, just to manage what's going on currently?
So in terms of the in-year risks to revenues, I think the in-year borrowing, so the Scottish Government has borrowing powers of £500 million for smoothing sort of the timing of receipts and spending. And I think, especially given the sort of update to the block grant adjustment for the land transactions tax and the landfill tax in the autumn, looking at that, it looks like those kind of in-year borrowing powers will be sufficient for that sort of the risks there. I think there is a question about these rules on borrowing for kind of forecasts and revenue undershoots and shortfalls, etc. that does need to be addressed. So I think that is worth discussing, especially in the run up to the sort of renegotiation of the fiscal framework. But I do think it is my view that the biggest issue, where the biggest constraint has been, is in terms of like formulating policies and policy responses. I think that the powers do give a better protection for maybe not perfect protection, but there's a high degree of protection for kind of like the economic impacts of COVID-19 itself on the budget. But what the policies are and it was almost by design. The rules are designed to sort of like basically prevent the Scottish Government taking a different fiscal stance to the UK government. So to prevent it from borrowing, basically having a higher level of borrowing, as a policy stance. That means at the moment it can kind of slow down the policy response, I think. So I think that is where the more serious issue is. If I may just kind of follow on, I think one issue that is worth talking about is that borrowing powers, would never be the appropriate response to a long-term kind of potentially, hit to the economy. So one of the kind of quite strange features about the fiscal framework is that the way it was designed effectively insulated or protected Scotland from any risk that its welfare spending was higher or its tax revenues lower at the point of devolution, the so-called no detriment principle. But that any change in relative revenues or relative spending from that point on is purely borne by the Scottish Government. There's like 100%, of the risk at the margin for changes in its relative revenue performance or changes in its relative welfare performance. That's all borne by the Scottish Government. That's quite unusual internationally, and it might be worth considering whether that is appropriate. So the reason I mention that is that if, for example, the Scottish Government, the Scottish economy was to recover less quickly from COVID-19, and there are some elements of the economy which suggest that could be a risk, a higher reliance on hospitality and associated industries, a higher reliance on the oil and gas sector in particular. If that means the Scottish economy recovers more slowly from COVID-19, that would lead to sort of depressed revenues on an ongoing basis that borrowing could never really cover, because borrowing is for short-term falls in revenue, not for kind of ongoing falls in revenue. But I think it is worth considering whether the whole setup of the fiscal rules, whether that needs to be considered at some point to make it more in line with actually international norms, where there's a degree of risk sharing between the central and the devolved governments. But the sort of, all the idiosyncratic risk is not always borne by the devolved government.
Okay, thank you, convener.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, convener. I've just got the one question for David Phillips, if I may, and going back to this point that was touched on just a few moments ago around the Barnett formula. Because in your written submission, you make the point about the UK government potentially bypassing the Barnett formula if there's a differential impact from COVID-19. And yet we do know, as the convener alluded to a short time ago, that there are politicians in other parts of the UK, such as Wales and the north of England, who've always been very unhappy with the Barnett formula and believe that it gives Scotland an unfair advantage over them in terms of funding. So I just wonder if you think there's a risk that a short-term advantage from bypassing Barnett might end up in the long run being to Scotland's detriment if this was seized on as an opportunity to replace it with a needs-based system.
David?
I should probably say that I am someone that thinks the Barnett formula should be reformed for the long run. But I think one needs to distinguish between the Barnett formula and the level of funding for the different countries. Because the Barnett formula isn't what determines Scotland's level of funding. The Barnett formula just applies to the annual changes in funding. And actually, potentially in the long term, the Barnett formula could be of detriment to Scotland because of what's called the Barnett squeeze, whereby the Barnett formula effectively gives a population share of the increase in spending in England to Scotland and to Wales and to Northern Ireland, although Wales has negotiated a bit of a addition to that population share. But by adding a population share each year, that can mean over time the higher levels of spending in Scotland are slowly eroded because you're only adding a population share. You're not sort of adding a needs-based share to that level. So I think that it's not necessarily the case that reform of the Barnett formula would necessarily cost Scotland. I think what would cost Scotland is if they did a overall assessment of the overall funding levels, not just the Barnett formula, because it does look like, relative to the other parts of the UK, Scotland gets a somewhat higher level of funding. So I think I would distinguish between reform of the Barnett formula to make that a more suitable formula and looking at the funding levels. And I think you can kind of distinguish between those two things. The second thing I would say is that, again, same with the borrowing powers. I think what you can do is you can have rules that apply in moments of crises. And we've seen the Barnett formula bypassed in other cases where it's deemed to be inappropriate for particular things. I think that would be an option here. Whether or not it would affect the politics of it going forward and make it more likely to kind of question the whole sort of structure of funding, I think is a question that politicians are probably better placed to answer. I think the UK government has already started to look at that question, though, and its negotiations with the Welsh government on the fiscal framework for Wales, I think, were a precursor to reopening some of the kind of questions from the Scottish fiscal framework negotiations. So whether or not that's already on the table somewhere, I think is an open question.
Is that you, Murdo?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure if George Adams still wants to come in. I'll come back to you, George, if you do, but because of that, I'm going to go straight to Patrick Harvey. Sorry, broadcasting.
Thank you, convener, and good afternoon to the witnesses. I'll maybe just pursue the point that Murdo Fraser and Mr. Phillips were discussing there. In the absence of a fully renegotiated and consensually agreed reform to the Barnett formula or any other aspect of our fiscal relationship, isn't it clear that a short-term bypassing of the formula would have to be done in a way that it ignored any kind of principle of consent? The most politically significant bypassing in recent years was when Theresa May's minority government gave additional funding to Northern Ireland to secure a political deal with the DUP, for example, and that caused huge amounts of political controversy. If the UK government was to do something similar here, then unless it only benefited the devolved areas at the expense of England, which seems highly unlikely, then that bypassing would have to be done against the express objections of devolved governments. Wouldn't that destroy any trust and possibility that there was for political coordination on the very difficult choices that lie ahead?
Well, I think what I would hope for is to be sort of a degree of maturity on all sides of that sort of political debate. So I guess the scenario I have in mind, where a Barnett formula bypass might be, most warranted, would be consider an example where there was a significant flare-up of COVID-19 in one part of the UK, whilst it remained under control in another part of the UK. So, for example, that could be in one of the devolved nations, or it could be in a region of England. The way the Barnett formula works would effectively, if it was in one of the devolved nations, they wouldn't get additional money unless you spent, the equivalent population share of money in England, which could be, substantially much larger. Depending on the size of the region in England affected by any, potential flare-up and need to kind of offer additional funding to health and local government, etc., that could imply, more than the equivalent money being spent in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So I think they would need to. I would hope that in those circumstances that the UK government would understand, look, there's a particular issue in Northern Ireland because there's been a flare-up. I would also hope the Scottish and Welsh governments would understand there's a particular issue in Yorkshire or Greater London. We understand that requires something to bypass. I would hope that's the case. But I do understand that the kind of, the fiscal frameworks and the rules around it are political as well. I think kind of the ultimate thing I would want to see with the Barnett formula is it to be replaced by a formula which does try to take account of the differential needs of the different parts of the UK, so that funding is not effectively an historical accident, which is kind of what it is under the Barnett formula.
Okay, I take the point about a potential future flare-up that was localised, but we probably don't have time to discuss this in depth, but it does seem to me that if a particular part of the UK was to re-enter lockdown, for example, then reinstating a furlough scheme for that area would be a much bigger cost than the immediate health costs, for example. But I also wanted to ask about the devolved tax powers that we have, which you only touch on a little bit about the tax options in Scotland in your paper. To what extent do you feel that the ability is there to ensure tax and other measures prevent the COVID crisis and the COVID recovery resulting in an even more unequal society? Do we have the ability to ensure that recovery closes the inequality gap in incomes and wealth, or are we lacking the measures that are required to achieve that?
I think the Scottish Government's powers, actually, the taxes it has powers over are some of those which are sort of most directly linked to redistribution. So the income tax powers it has allows it to change the progressivity of the income tax system. The powers over property taxes, especially council tax, but also the land transactions tax, that allows it to change the progressivity of those taxes. And the Scottish Government, in fact, has actually made use of the powers to increase the progressivity of both income tax and property tax historically. So I think there's a degree of flexibility in the existing tax regime to sort of change the balance of taxation during the recovery phase. I think there's also the powers, I think, to kind of top up welfare benefits as well, if the Scottish Government wanted to do that. I think what the Scottish Government doesn't have the powers to do at the moment is to take a decision about whether to use the tax system to stimulate the economy, if you like, because of the rules around borrowing, which effectively say that you can only borrow for forecast shortfalls. You can't borrow for policy measures, and stimulus would be a policy measure. Again, I think there's a case for considering whether that is appropriate in the short term. Again, different, to reflect different judgments we make in Scotland, reflect different circumstances in Scotland. I think that being opened up as a longer term policy option. I think if there's one thing the UK government is going to stand very firm on in its negotiations for the next fiscal framework, it will be around, allowing Scotland to take a different fiscal stance, effectively allowing Scotland to borrow more in the longer term. In the short term, that could be a way to use the tax system to actually provide more stimulus, is to give short term powers to borrow for policy.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Patrick. That concludes our questions to our witnesses, and can I thank Mark and David very much indeed for providing us with your evidence today. We've covered a lot of detail, and it's not always the easiest way to do it in this virtual process, so I'm very grateful to everyone involved. As we have no further public items on our agenda today, I now close this public part of the meeting and ask members to log on to our MS Teams meeting to discuss our work programme in private. Thank you very much.